Well, Jeffrey here. Well, I'm going to start installing the main bearings on my Cat 60. This is the rear one. I have it all cleaned out underneath. And this is the center main. And you can see the center main where I'm pointing there. There's a groove. And a pin in the lower bearing shell fits in that groove to locate the lower bearing shell fore and aft, as the center main is the one with the thrust surfaces on. So next I'm going to first put in the rear main bearing. Set the bearing shell in and rotate it halfway around, and it should be in place. There's no pin for locating it, so when the top cap goes on, we might have to adjust it fore and aft a little bit to match up with the top cap. Now I'm going to drop in the center main, and you should be able to see the pin on there that lines up with that groove to locate it fore and aft. There it is, and spin her halfway around. Right in there you can see as to where the bearing was before. Now I'm going to go look at the other side. That looks pretty good. Now we got to let the crank down. Pull the bar out that I had under the center. Now I'll crawl underneath and take the jack out that's under the flywheel. Hopefully I won't be lifting up the crank again. Now it's time for shims. These are the shims. First I'm going to put the shims in just as they were and check the clearance with plastic gauge. Now I'm going to put the shims in on this side. And I'm going to go get the bearing cap. I have it on good authority that the bearing clearance should be 4 to 6 thousandths. So I have plastic gauge here. It has a range of 4 to 9 thousandths. Try and get a long piece on there to reach the full length of the bearing. The bearing shell's going on. You have to figure out how to get it in there. It won't go on with bolts on the flywheel turned the way they are. I gotta think about this for a second. Still won't go on. And now I do remember that the crank has to be turned in a certain position because the bolts aren't evenly spaced on the flywheel where it bolts to the flange and the crank. And I'm guessing that was to facilitate the removal of this bearing in the conditions that I am doing it. Now I'm going to attempt to move the flywheel rearward a little bit, taking play out on the crank. Oh, I think that's going to do it. I'm sure you could see it move. Once again, try the main bearing cap. And there it goes. Cap on. I actually did quite a bit of wrestling. Cap on and off a number of times, trying to get it fit down in place with the shims located properly. But I managed to get it. So now I'm going to put the nuts on and tighten it down, and then take it off and see how the plastic gauge looks. Oh, I gotta move I gotta move the camera, it's in my way. I tighten the cap down. And I loosened them. I'm gonna take it off and check the plastic gauge. Let's see how hard the cap will come off. Oh, that came off nice. Oh. See, if you look at it here, the plastic gauge squeezed real wide, like it's less than 4 thousandths clearance. And on the other end, by the flywheel, it isn't squeezed much at all, like it's a lot more than 4 thousandths clearance. So why it should change from end to end, who knows. I may re-clean the shims and check that. But I'm going to get my little gauge now and compare it. You can see where the plastic gauge is on the bearing here. And if you look at this end, there it would indicate it has about 8 thousandths clearance, and the range is supposed to be 4 to 6. On this end, it's wider than the 4 thousandths, so it's probably down to like 3 thousandths clearance. So that would be a difference of from 3 thousandths up to like 8 thousandths on this end. 5 thousandths difference. I think I may clean the surfaces up better and clean the shims up more and retry it. So that'll be my next step, recheck it. Well, I double checked all the shims, cleaned them really good and made sure they were good and flat. And I made sure the mating surfaces here were good and flat, no burrs or anything on them, and clean them down, and put in some more plastic gauge and tightened it down very carefully, alternately, with all the threads lubricated properly and oil on where the nut meets the cap. And the result of the plastic gauge looks much better now. I'm going to call this one 5 thousandths. I'll call this one 7 thousandths. So with the range being, I was told 4 to 6, and he says whatever you do, you don't want it tight. I'm going to call this good. So I'll make sure the shims are lined up again, clean off the plastic gauge, and hopefully put this cap on for the last time. There you can see where the shims are. And I've never seen an engine where the shims don't go around the bolt holes to locate them. And with trial and error, I realized the only way to line them up is to push them against the crank journal. Then I move the whole stack back so the stack touches the crank flange there. Then in turn, I will go back like this and just push the whole stack forward to line up with the flange on the bearing shell. Now it should be ready to put the bearing cap on. Now I'm going to drop the bearing cap in place, hopefully for the last time. And it appears to have dropped down in place properly. Now I'm re-oiling threads in the nuts. I'm going to reinstall the nuts. Probably isn't necessary, but I'm putting them on the same exact studs they were on when I plastic gauged it the last time. I'm also looking to somewhat see what direction the cotter pin hole in the stud is in. So I'll have an idea when it comes to lining the nuts up to get the cotter pins in. First I'm just pulling them down finger tight. And now I want to gradually tighten them. First I'm giving each one a quarter of a turn. Now I'll give them, that one feels like it was a little looser, but they all feel about the same now. Tighten them each a little bit more. They're all feeling quite equal. I have to move the camera to finish tightening. Now I'm going to pour some oil down the oil hole so the crank will have a little more oil on it. Seeing the crank is turning, so I'm going to take this opportunity to show you that, see, here's a space where no bolts holding the flywheel to the flange. It has to be turned in this position so that this flange here of the bearing cap will fit up by. If it's turned any other way, that flange will interfere with the flywheel bolts and you can't get the cap off. So that's what I meant before about the flywheel had to be turned in the right position in order to get the cap on and off. This is a learn as you go procedure working on this thing. You see there's the hole in the flywheel is tapered for the starting bar, so it comes out when it starts, but apparently it has hit there a few times because you can see the nick in the good notch in the frame rail. Hopefully that never happens to me. Put the bottom of the flywheel and turn it for the first time with the cap tightened on. On the reassembly, oh, it turns beautiful. I just turned that little bit first because I'm going to show you something else. Next I'm going to do the center main bearing, and I could put the cap on with the crank turned the way it is, but I'm going to turn the crank all the way around a couple times first, make sure it turns freely with that rear cap on. And also I'm going to stop the crank with these rod throws in the down position so that it's just easier to get at all the nuts for the bearing cap. So I'm going to spin it a couple full turns now. That noise you hear is the clutch plate dragging. It's turning really nice. So I went over 2 times around, and I stopped